she be allowed to praise terrorists? In America, yes. Our First Amendment says no law may abridge freedom of speech, as long as you don't incite imminent lawless action. But she was in Canada. There, politicians are eager to punish hate speech, speech crimes they call them, with life in prison. Canadian bureaucrats already have the power to punish people who criticize them. People like Ezra Levant, publisher of Rebel News. He was punished because he advertised his book, The Libranos, which criticizes Justin Trudeau's Liberal government.
Oh, he hated that book. He hated the cover art, which looked like he was a mafioso.
Canadian officials say lawn signs for the book violate Canada's election rules.
5 years later, I'm still in court over a book that criticized Justin Trudeau.
Levant secretly taped his interrogation.
Is anyone in your office investigating any other books about Justin Trudeau or just the book that's critical of him?
You're under arrest for assault.
Levant's reporters sometimes get arrested. The video shows he didn't assault anyone.
This is your Canada now, folks.
It makes me even more glad I live in the United States, where we have that First Amendment. In England, this man was arrested simply for posting this meme suggesting that the gay rights movement is authoritarian.
You should not be doing this to me. I expect my freedom of speech.
In Scotland, a new law makes it a crime to stir up hatred. Harry Potter's author says, "I'll break that law."
J.K. Rowling says Scotland's new anti-hate crime law is a threat to free speech.
In Brazil, this judge demanded Twitter block certain accounts. Elon Musk said, "No, we'll lose revenue, but principles matter more."
It's dangerous. You have to rely on a few big people to protect your freedom, but it's such a welcome turn of events.
Ezra Levant has a lot to say about speech and its enemies. Here's our full conversation. So you have your reporter out to try to interview Trudeau, who doesn't want to talk to him. He got roughed up.
Our reporter's 62 years old. He was with a cameraman. No one in a million years would have thought he was a threat. He was standing with the local police waiting for Justin Trudeau to arrive at a Christmas party. The cops knew who he was. He was bantering with them. Trudeau pulls up in his entourage. His bodyguards jump out and beat the tar out of our guy and don't even charge him with anything. And then that same reporter scrums the deputy prime minister walking down the street.
Why is your government supporting Islamo-nationalism? What? What are you doing?
Again, the same Royal Canadian Mounted Police bodyguards grab him and say, "You assaulted us."
You're under arrest for assault.
We don't know what he did before the camera rolled. Maybe he did assault someone.
In that case, every moment was clearly on camera. And that got 13 million views in a day. And I think the reason wasn't just that a journalist was arrested, which is sort of shocking, but that the police so casually and naturally gaslit him and anyone watching. "Oh, you assaulted us." It was so obvious he didn't.
How am I under arrest? You bumped into me. You pushed into me. You bumped. I was just scrubbing. I got my credentials here, and you just bumped into me. I didn't come here to cause any trouble. I came here to do my job, and now I'm handcuffed.
The way he asked the question, he's almost looking for a confrontation.
He was getting straight to the point. Our company is banned from attending many press conferences because we don't have government credentials. We don't have access to press conferences. So this was a 30-second moment where we could scrum a politician. And she could ignore us. She could answer, but she smirked as her bodyguards roughed him up.
The way he did it is provocative, like he's just looking to get viewers.
Let's say that's true. Let's say that there was no public interest or value to the question.
Still ought to be your right to say.
I think so. I mean, we have the right to be wrong. We have the right to ask great questions. And we have the right to ask stupid questions. And by the way, every one of us in life is going to have moments where we say something dumb. It shouldn't be criminal to be wrong. Our little company, Rebel News, was banned from attending the government-run election debates. For some reason, Trudeau nationalized the election debates every 4 years. So he controls who's allowed in, and we applied to come in, and we were forbidden. We ran to the federal court, who granted us an injunction, so our reporters were allowed in at the last hour. And they asked a question of Trudeau. The ink was still wet on the judgment that said, "No, we are journalists. We have a right to be there." And he said, "No, I refuse to even pretend that you're journalists."
quite frankly, I won't call it a media organization, your group of individuals need to take accountability for some of the polarization that we're seeing in this country.
It feels authoritarian.
But that's fine. He doesn't have to answer your questions.
I suppose it's true, but from the top down to say they're anathema, they're outside polite company, they're disinformation, they're foreign agents, they should be banned, they should be deboosted in the algorithm. And frankly, wink, wink, bodyguards, if you want to rough them up a bit, I won't say a word. I think all the accusations put about Donald Trump going to war against the press, it actually has happened in Canada. I mean, the beating of our reporter David Menzies reminded me of when the Turkish president Erdogan came to town and his bodyguards pummeled Turkish dissidents in the street. Canada is falling that way. When Justin Trudeau said the country he most admires is China, he meant it.
Admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime.
Canada is losing some of that free spirit that we used to have.
Organizations like yours that continue to spread misinformation and disinformation is part of why we're seeing such unfortunate anger and lack of understanding of basic science.
You misled people on COVID.
Well, actually, I think our questions turned out to be the right questions to ask. And even if we were wrong...
Your questions meaning, does everyone need the vaccine?
Well, one of our questions that we put to Trudeau in a national leaders debate, we had to fight our way in there. We had to go to court to get the right to be in there. And what did we ask? We asked, should people get credit for getting sick with COVID and then naturally overcoming it and having natural immunity? Should they get...
Forbidden.
Yeah, should we get credit for that, or do they still have to take the jab? That's a pretty good question.
Forbidden.
Trudeau didn't like the question, tried to keep us out. When we asked the question, he ignored the question. That was the right question to ask. And even if it was wrong, I think there's something to the saying, no such thing as a stupid question, especially when you're questioning a politician. I think you want politicians peppered with questions all the time, and not just the ones he likes, not just the ones he agrees with. The fact that he clearly promotes journalists that he trusts and demotes journalists that he doesn't trust, I think that's a feather in our cap. What kind of journalist wants to be a house pet for the president or prime minister? What kind of journalist wants the prime minister to say about him, I trust him? You trust him? No. His viewers should trust him. You should be afraid of him. I want politicians to always be a little bit afraid of the journalists, not to have them in their pocket.
Journalists like to get close to powerful people.
It's a hazard. They like the familiarity. They like being invited to Christmas parties. Absolutely. That is a hazard of the profession. But taking government grants and winning government certification, you don't want that. Just a couple of years ago, I wrote a book about Justin Trudeau, sort of a knockoff of The Sopranos. I called it The Libranos because he's with the Liberal Party. Oh, he hated that book. He hated the cover art, which looked like he was a mafioso. And so I was prosecuted for publishing an illegal book in the Canadian federal election. What's an illegal book? They claimed it wasn't really a book. They claimed it was a campaign ad.
We need to determine if the signage was actually promotion of the book or was it political advertising.
And certain campaign ads are illegal in Canada.
Yeah, and now there's an exemption for books in the promotion of books, which is why I was so surprised. There were 24 books published about Justin Trudeau in the 2019 Canadian election. Mine was the most critical, and then there were 23 love letters to him. Mine was the only one prosecuted, and by the way, it's still before the courts 5 years later. But I was grilled by two 30-year veterans of the Mounties. And I knew no one would believe that. So I brought in a secret camera this time because I just thought no one is going. I went to the secure headquarters of the election law enforcers and I filmed the interview. When they asked me point blank, why didn't you register this book with the government? That's what they actually asked me.
Did you give any consideration of saying maybe I should register as a third party for this circumstance?
And that would have just been a formality, right?
They asked me about my plans for the book. What were my plans?
Just wondered if you had a communication plan or a marketing plan. What was your marketing plan, sir?
What was my editorial plan? What was my business plan? You know, it reminded me of the former Soviet Union in Romania. You had to register your typewriter with the police. They took a typing sample because every typewriter was a little different. So if they discovered some samizdat, they could check it against, well, whose typewriter this was. In Romania, you had to register your typewriter with the government. In Canada, the state of the law right now is if you write a political book that the government doesn't like, you've got to register that with the government. Author being grilled for not registering his book. Where were the free speech groups? Where was our version of the ACLU? Where was PEN Canada? Where was Amnesty International? Where was the Canadian Association of Journalists?
Where were they?
Silent, because they've all been colonized with this government subsidy money. Or maybe they just don't like the cut of my jib, and maybe they think I'm too right-wing. But we were alone in court. We're alone in court in all these battles.
This is not unique to Canada. Italy, France, Germany, Russia, China require registration from news outlets.
Not only did I have to register my book with the government, which I refused to do, but Canada's created a kind of journalism license called the QCJO, Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization. We applied for that. I wanted to see what would happen. They studied our news outlet for months, and they read our news stories, and they had an expert panel at our version of the IRS say, nope, it's not qualified journalism. Stamp. I mean, it's the government. It used to be the press held the government to account. Now in Canada, the government wants to hold the press to account. And with that registration, with that license, like you say, you get accreditation to press conferences, you get government grants, your subscribers get a tax benefit on their subscription. But the most important thing that QCJO news license gives you is Trudeau has the power to boost the search engine results for qualified Canadian journalism organizations. So let's say Trudeau...
To tell the social media companies.
That's right. He has the power to order Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram to boost the trusted sources. And what's trusted? What his IRS says, the Canada Revenue Agency says. So Justin Trudeau no longer has to ban Rebel News or ban a journalist he doesn't like. He wouldn't be that clumsy. He would just say to Facebook and YouTube, downrank anyone who is not quality, not trustworthy.
Has he done this, and do they comply?
He has not done it yet as far as we know, but he has set up this news license called the QCJO, and he continues to legislate his censorship laws. It is his most active file, more than anything else he cares about.
I don't know what Facebook or Google would do, but for Twitter, I bet Elon Musk would say, no, go to hell.
One of the things in Trudeau's latest law called Bill C-63 is a fine for social media companies that don't obey certain orders, 24-hour takedown notices. If certain things aren't taken down within 24 hours, there are fines up to 8% of global revenues for the social media companies, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know if that would withstand a lawsuit or a free trade complaint, but Justin Trudeau wants to rule the internet.
Talking about these other countries where you have to be licensed, Germany even kindly puts it in English. This will ensure diversity of opinions.
The spectrum of diverse opinions, I think, would change person by person. Some people would not want something on the right. Some people would not want something on the left. And one thing we know about politicians is that they wouldn't want something that opposes them. Germany is actually fairly closed-minded. There's a number of parties there that are skeptics on global warming, skeptics on open migration. And the government is, in fact, talking about banning them. There's a party called the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany. You can see that the words on the piece of paper are different from how they act, like the old Soviet constitution. They'll prosecute whoever they want.
Now, a new proposed bill would give you life in prison for advocating genocide.
The Liberal government is hoping its long-promised online harms bill will help protect people.
The bill will also sharply raise the penalties for those who are guilty of advocating genocide. The maximum sentence under the bill will be life imprisonment.
Pretty subjective.
It's a standalone hate crime that could cover other things too. And Canada is very lenient when it comes to prison time. There's no such thing as life imprisonment in Canada. At most, it means 25 years. It's so crazy to me.
Well, genocide's pretty bad.
It's not for doing genocide. It's for saying genocidal things. And by the way, I'm not pro-genocide or pro-saying genocidal things. In the last 7 months, you've seen actual crimes in Canada. A synagogue was shot up. Another had a Molotov cocktail thrown at it. There's been tremendous death threats and vandalism. We don't need a new law governing ideas or words. I think a lot of the problems Canada's had in the last 7 months about hate are actual crimes, not hate crimes. And I'm not sure if I would trust the government to implement a law prosecuting ideas or feelings, let alone one with a life in prison. How about start with more basic laws like not uttering death threats or not shooting up a synagogue? I don't think more laws would solve the problems of hate. Free speech is the gift you must give to your opponent if you want it for yourself. That's the hardest thing to do, though, John. The people we hate the most, we've got to give precisely them the same freedom of speech we want for ourselves. Because what if they're the prime minister, the president, the prosecutor next week? We don't want to give our enemies the power to censor us. We better not give ourselves the power to censor them.
Countries in Europe have bans on denying the Holocaust. There's a benefit to denying the Holocaust?
I think that denying the Holocaust is something that hurts my feelings, to use a phrase. But I know this. If someone doesn't know about the Holocaust and wants to ask questions about it and is smashed down and called, you're a hater, you're an anti-Semite, that's probably not going to convince them that the Holocaust was real. Whereas if you air the question out and have a debate and answer the questions. I did a tour of the 9/11 Museum and Memorial in Manhattan. And in the Q&A with the tour guide, everyone asked their conspiracy theories. I was actually shocked with the questions that were put to the tour guide. And he didn't say, shut up.
Did the CIA do this?
Yeah, and how can metal burn? Like, how does fire melt steel? Like, every theory I'd ever heard in the corners of the internet, people put it to the tour guide. And instead of saying, how dare you, that's disinformation, he calmly and in a loving way, actually, explained the answer. And I think it turned some minds around. And that's the analogy I would use on the Holocaust. There are many conspiracy theories. It didn't happen. It was less than 6 million. It's a hoax. Okay, that's out there. Whether you ban the conversation or not, it's out there. How about being like that wonderful tour guide at the 9/11 Museum and calmly proving and answering and disabusing people of falsehoods? You're not going to convince everybody. But I left thinking, that guy knows his stuff. I trust him. And the tone in which he answered was compelling.
There's now a campaign to encourage people to report behavior that crosses the line.
A publicity campaign is now encouraging people to report behaviour which crosses a line.
That was just introduced in Scotland, and in the first week or so, 7,000 people complained. I guess that would jam up the system, but even if there was no trial or hearing about it, police over there have a strange thing called a non-crime hate incident. It's like a social credit score. It's stuck on your record. You weren't convicted of anything. You weren't charged with anything, but someone whispered something about you, and now it's on your record. That really is China-style social credit, a little bit Orwellian. And I think that is coming here through big tech. And I think the merger of big tech and big government is the scariest of all. Here's why. If the government comes to censor you, maybe you can fight back in the courts. Maybe there's some transparency to how the decisions are made. But if the government outsources censorship to big tech, you don't even know how it happened. You don't know why your YouTube account was shut down. You don't know why your Facebook page was demonetized, because a private company did it. But as we see in some court cases in the United States now, there are some back channels from big government to big tech. I'm worried about that connection there. And anyone who believes in civil liberties should be.
But most people aren't worried. Most people say, yeah, we should have rules against spreading hate.
it's right to say we should try and be polite. We should try and be neighborly. We should be tolerant. I think those are all important values. But every once in a while, the ability to speak the truth is a more pressing value, even if we're going to hurt a feeling, even if we're going to upset the apple cart. That's what freedom of speech means. It means it trumps those other values. It doesn't mean you can't also believe in politeness. You can't also believe in civility. But you need that, in case of fire, break glass, freedom of speech when there's a crisis, when you just need to speak the truth. And by the way, for different people, that's a different crisis. And you have to give people that peaceful outlet for their grievance. If you cork them up, if you don't let them have the safety valve of free speech, they'll explode in another way, possibly including violence. I think there's a correlation between the countries that have the least freedom of speech and countries that have violent terrorism. Because if they're not given a peaceful outlet for their ideas, and by the way, if someone floats their ideas in an election and their ideas fail, at least they'll know they had a chance at it. If they never had the chance to express themselves, it'll confirm in their mind that they've been persecuted. I think free speech is a preventive mechanism that prevents an escalation of problems.
People don't like stirring up hatred. People like laws like this.
You can't ban hate just by passing a law any more than you can tell someone to love another person by passing a law. Hate usually comes from an underlying feeling of a grievance. And until you deal with that grievance, people are going to have that emotion.
But it feels right. And the politician says,
unless your behaviour is threatening or abusive and intends to stir up hatred, then you have nothing to worry about.
You have nothing to worry about.
It depends on who the prosecutor is. For example, in Rwanda, during their brutal genocidal civil war, they had hate speech laws. But of course, the government thought their opponents were the hate speechers, and not vice versa. Weimar Germany had hate speech laws. When Hitler took over, of course, they flipped. I don't like calls for genocide, but look at the conflict in Gaza right now. Jews in Israel say that the chant "from the river to the sea" is a call for the genocide of Israel. But the Palestinian side said Israel is conducting a genocide against them. Well, who's going to be the determiner of who's going to be prosecuted? I'm worried about a law like that gives a politician the chance to criminalize his peaceful opponent.
We elect politicians, say people, so they're the will of the majority, and they'll be reasonable or we'll throw them out of office.
Not if you can't campaign against them. Freedom of speech is a funny thing. It's one of the hardest freedoms to embrace, because you've got to give that gift to your opponents that you want for yourself. The government does rotate every once in a while. Joe Biden talked about having a digital safety commissioner, and Democrats were overjoyed by that. But maybe Donald Trump will win the next election, and who would be his digital safety commissioner? You've got to think about those powers of government being wielded by your opponents. And if you don't like that, you shouldn't wield those powers yourself. In England itself, police actually go to people's homes to talk to them about their Facebook posts. And don't tell me that's not an act of intimidation. Of course it is.
Not just talk to them, occasionally arresting people.
Remind me again why I'm being arrested.
This man was arrested just for retweeting this image. 4 Progress pride flags put together so they form a swastika. He wasn't supporting Nazis, just arguing that the woke movement is totalitarian.
And I tell you that if that happened in Vladimir Putin's Russia or in Xi Jinping's China, we would call it what it is: authoritarianism, censorship, bullying, and worse. Why are we okay with it if it happens in our great ally, the United Kingdom? We shouldn't be.
Should not be doing this to me. I expect my freedom of speech.
Police offered to reduce his charge if he paid $100 and took an anti-hate education course. He refused, and they backed down. Apparently, the police were embarrassed, and that's a good sign.
But look what they did to him. In the broad daylight, they went to his house, and all the neighbors were watching. They handcuffed him. Why did they handcuff him? Was he some physical menace? They took him away. And And it was the humiliation, and it was the deterrence. And how many people, and that was a fairly brave guy, he's a military veteran, he was confident in himself and his rights. But how many people watched that and said, yikes, if they can take on a strong, articulate man like that who knows his rights and how to fight back, they could crush me. I'd better self-censor. And I think it's the public humiliation. And why did they use police? Are there not more real crimes in the UK? They have an epidemic of knife stabbings, in the UK. There's many real crimes. I think it also...
They're sending a message that it's evil to take these vulnerable people and trash them on Facebook.
You know what's interesting? In the last 7 months in the UK and also in the US and Canada, there have been marches and protests, many of which have been very hateful, not just calling for hate.
We stand with the Palestinian resistance and their heroic and brave action on October 7th.
There's been typically anti-Semitic comments. Some of them have even called for violence. And I think people see the difference in policing for different political points of view. I've seen it with my own eyes, people waving the flags of terrorist groups on the streets. And police take a light touch with that.
It's just a flag.
There's a danger when the state bans certain ideas and not others. It erodes the respect of the police. It brings the legal system into disrepute. And I don't think you're reducing the hate when you police it in that way.
CNN says every day in Scotland, around 18 hate crimes are committed. Supporters of the law believe it provides much needed protection for the marginalized.
I want to know what a hate crime is. I know what a crime is. There's a list of them.
You hurt somebody because of their race or their group. You hate the group.
But the key word there is hurt. If you stab someone with hate in their heart, we know an actual crime was committed with the stabbing. And by the way, maybe hate should be an aggravating factor. It could be, as opposed to, some other form of violence. But the key is that it's an actual crime that was committed. The reason why you have to come up with all these bizarre laws like likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt is because real criminal law would throw out those complaints as baseless. It's not a crime to have hard feelings. Let me put it another way. There's no such thing as the right not to be offended. But there is, thank God, the right to be offended. And they don't have that in every country. If the government does something, if a powerful person does something, you have the right to be offended and to squawk about it. You don't get that right in every place. That's actually, the First Amendment gives you the right to be offended, but not the right not to be offended, which is really code for the power to shut someone else up.
The Scottish government says the legislation includes free speech protections.
The number one person against whom these complaints were filed was the former First Minister of Scotland himself, Hamza Yousaf, who championed this law. Thousands and thousands of complaints against him. What's the odds that that would ever be prosecuted? Do you think a cop is going to actually prosecute the First Minister of Scotland? No chance. So I think that there's partisan and ideological twist to such vague rules like that.
J.K. Rowling says Scotland's new anti-hate crime law is a threat to free speech.
One of the brilliant things that J.K. Rowling did was she said, anyone who's charged under this, I'm going to repeat their words. Let them come after me. What's important there is that J.K. Rowling is such a big personality. She has the wealth to fight a strong defense.
And the fame.
And the reason the fame is so useful is that you can't really have a law in a democracy if the people don't really support it, if it's contrary to the sensibilities of the people.
And they haven't come to arrest her.
No, and I think that she and Elon Musk, I think, are the two people in the world who have done more to stop cancel culture. Because cancel culture requires the bully to be bigger than anyone else. If there's someone who refuses to be bullied, who's actually bigger than the bully, and I think J.K. Rowling and Elon Musk both meet that definition, bullying doesn't really work anymore because the big guy says, well, I'll help you out. I'll protect your Twitter feed. I'll repeat your anti-trans comment that was going to get you prosecuted. It's dangerous. You have to rely on a few big people to protect your freedom, but it's such a welcome turn of events.
Let's talk about what Musk is doing lately. And not the early stuff and liberal versus conservative, but Brazil says, take these accounts down. Musk says, no.
Well, it was even worse. This crusading judge says, take the accounts down. I'm not going to tell you why. I'm not going to tell you what rule they broke. I'm not going to tell you which tweet broke the rule. And incredibly, I'm not going to let you say I'm the guy who pulled the tweet down.
Brazil has a law guaranteeing freedom of speech.
Well, so did the former Soviet Union. It comes down to, do you have a culture of freedom and do you have a legal system that values it?
The Brazilian Supreme Court chief said freedom of expression doesn't mean freedom of aggression.
Well, I think it does, as long as it's not violent. I mean, you hear little slogans like that. Free speech doesn't include hate speech. Well, hate isn't, like I say, human emotion, and it motivates. By the way, you can take hate and transform it into beautiful things. You can take that motivation to solve a problem in the world. You can be full of hate of something and say, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to campaign for change. I'm going to build a solution. I'm going to knock on 1,000 doors and win an election. And what's your deep underlying motivation? Well, maybe it's that raw feeling of I hate what's going on, or I hate the president or the prime minister, but I'm not going to do anything violent or antisocial about it. I'm going to use that as energy. I think it's okay. And by the way, you need a lobotomy to remove hate from every human heart. The thing is not to deny it or remove it, but to transform it and to rise above it. Now, the thing about an international company like Twitter, it has to obey the law of the land in every country in which it operates. So Musk said, that's actually against Brazilian law. I'm going to fight you. But there are some places where I think Elon Musk is just going to say, we're not going to operate here. And we see that with the free speech platform called Rumble as well. They were kicked out of France because they wouldn't pull down certain things. So it's a miracle that business people who are motivated by financial profits are putting free speech principles first. But I suppose in the bigger scheme, if you lose your free speech principles, there goes your communications company. There goes the whole idea of a social media platform. There was recently a stabbing of a Christian clergyman that was live streamed. And Australia's prime minister said that needs to be taken down. And Australia's e-safety commissioner said, taken down in Australia and in the rest of the world too. To which Elon Musk replied, we can't let politicians in one country control the internet for the whole world. I love that he's fighting back. I love that he obviously is immune to shakedowns by individual countries. Yeah, so far.
The Australian Prime Minister. This guy's showing his arrogance. He's a billionaire in the U.S. who thinks he's above Australian law.
Well, in a way, he is above Australian law in the other 198 countries in the world.
Shortly after our interview, an Australian judge ruled that the government's censorship demand was overreach. Elon Musk and Twitter don't need to censor the video.
But in China, where Elon Musk does business with his other companies, I mean, I'm worried that if we rely on one man or one woman for our freedom of speech, we'll be in trouble soon enough. I was in Davos, Switzerland in January at the World Economic Forum. I was a non-accredited journalist. And the two names I heard more than any others were Donald Trump and Elon Musk. They wanted to stop Trump, and they felt that Elon Musk, by freeing Twitter, was foiling their plans. In the minds of these VVIPs in that place, they were linked.
VVIP, very, very important.
Oh, it was quite a, I know I'm digressing here a little bit, but one of the chief themes in the World Economic Forum get-together in January of 2024 was censorship, using AI to censor, using big tech to censor, ideological filters, keywords that you can't say, that are politically charged. That's what they want AI to do, is to be like, just like you have some software like a spell check, an automatic spell check. They want an automatic spell check for ideology. And I believe it's because 2024 is a presidential election. And in the past, the tech companies have been very obedient and complicit in censorship. In the 2020 election, they put their thumb on the scale. And in other countries, they did. And Elon Musk, I think, is breaking their pact of silence on that.
React to some politicians and pundits. This is a former columnist for the New York Times.
Speech is actually freer when everybody can feel safe, can know that they're not going to get harassed, can know that they're not going to get outed, can know that they're not going to get piled on.
Well, look at those words, how subjective they are. Harassed. What's the difference between a rollicking debate and harassment? Well, it's in the eye of the beholder. What about a pile-on versus a kind of speaker's corner environment with heckles? And I think people can choose the level of robustness that they want. On social media, you can put on a content filter for to screen out adult words, for example. Every social media platform has sort of a child safety mode. If people want to be in a roiling debate, they can. You don't want to give a veto to the thinnest skinned person in the room, including for subjective tests. Like the law in Scotland and the law in Canada aren't based on objective harm. If I, God forbid, punch you in the nose and I break your nose, you can measure that. Yes, it really happened. But what if I hurt your feelings or caused you to have hard feelings about someone else? I can't measure that.
Or mock you and encourage other people to maybe beat you up because you're mocking trans people.
There's a difference between mocking someone versus saying, go and beat them up in an imminent and compelling way. I think that would be counseling a kind of crime. That's very different than these hate speech laws. And Trudeau just introduced a new bill called C-63, the Online Harms Act, and it has a bounty in it, a $20,000 bounty. If you have anything online, even an old Facebook post 5 years ago, if that is likely to cause, and he's changed the words now, detestation or vilification, then you can complain to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. If you win, you get $20,000 from the person you complain against, plus they might have to pay a fine of $50,000 to the government. So now you've weaponized every critic, every censor, everyone who was just before.
Incentivize them to complain about you.
That's right. And hundreds and hundreds, there's unlimited complaints. And if only 1 in 100 gets through to the target, that's quite a good living you can make. One last wrinkle, you find this hard to believe, but you can actually make secret complaints under this new law. So you don't even know who's complaining against you. It could be a disgruntled ex. It could be some, activist. You don't even know who complained against you. If they succeed in their complaint, you have to pay them $20,000. This is an army of Red Guard activists that they're creating. That's Canada.
Well, you don't have a First Amendment.
No, and it's really showing right now. I think that something else has happened in Canada because so many other journalists are on the government dole. That's made them reluctant to speak out.
What do you mean they're on the government dole?
In Canada, Justin Trudeau has introduced subsidies for journalists, hundreds of millions of dollars, which in the Canadian scale would be like billions of dollars in the U.S.
Now some American governments are saying the media business is dying. We should subsidize the ones that cover important things.
Well, the media business has never been more dynamic. There's never been more content creators, bloggers, vloggers. Not all of them went to journalism school. They have a different point of view.
They aren't covering the legislature like the old ones were.
There's some truth to that, but look at the conflict of interest. If you've got a reporter who every day reports on the government, is now taking money from the government, I mean, if someone is having trouble visualizing why that's a problem, swap in another funder, big oil, big tobacco. If the cigarette company said, hey, we really care about journalism, we're going to give $1 billion a year to journalists, and they don't disclose this on air, they don't have a disclaimer at the bottom of their article, everyone would know instinctively you are conflicted. In Canada, 99% of the journalists are take the government subsidy, so they're conflicted. And they obviously don't report about their conflict. The largest news agency in Canada is the state broadcaster. It's larger than all others combined. So there's a reluctance by ordinary working journalists to stand up to the government and certainly to stand up for rogue citizen journalists. So whereas maybe 20 years ago, there would have been a lot of press companies going to court to stand up on the principle of freedom of the press, now we're often in court alone. And measured by the number of bills that Trudeau has introduced, he's introduced 3 or 4 bills on censorship in the last 2 years alone, more than he has on inflation or the cost of living. I think he's obsessed with it. He's introduced a bill that allows him to regulate the internet, which he couldn't do before, that gives him the power to alter the algorithms of the big tech companies.
Canadians must like this. He gets reelected.
I don't think there's any demand for. People might say they want a guardian of the internet, but when you press them, how about for you? They say, no, I can be my own guardian. I agree with you that I think a lot of Canadians and Americans and Brits want a net nanny, but for the other guy, not for themselves, because I think they find it demeaning and condescending that they can't choose for themselves. It's always a government claiming to be fixing a problem. In Canada, when they introduced the latest censorship laws, they said it was about terrorism and child pornography. No, it was actually about censoring politics.
They didn't want the truckers' strike.
That's a perfect example. In Canada, the dominant media were critical of the truckers' strike, but it was citizen journalists with little cell phones and blogs that told the story. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, called them every name. He said they're misinformation and disinformation.
What, called the editors of the...
Called the truckers what they were saying. He said the truckers were spreading disinformation. The state broadcaster said Vladimir Putin was organizing the trucker convoy.
Russian actors could be continuing to fuel things as this protest grows, but perhaps even instigating it from the outset.
They actually said that. In the end, none of those things were true. Canada was really hurtling down an authoritarian path. There were curfews in Canada from 10 p.m. till 5 a.m. There were vaccine mandates and they were much more harsh than in the United States. I think Canada was in the wrong direction. It was these rogue truckers and rogue journalists that broke the false consensus. And that's the thing. One man's misinformation or disinformation is another man's scoop, another man's exclusive. And who knows what the truth will be right away. We didn't know where the virus came from in the early days, but it was deemed disinformation to say it had anything to do with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Well, how do we know? Let's have a debate about it. Let's talk about it. Let's truth and falsehood.
No, you're off YouTube. You're off Facebook.
Yeah, and I think that to this day, for example, YouTube has an official disclaimer about global warming. If you take a contrarian view on global warming, it will tell you
merely saying we can deal with it. It exists, but we can adjust.
One of their policies during the pandemic was if you disagreed with local health officials. So if you disagree with politicians, you were violating community guidelines. Not if you were scientifically wrong, but who determines that? If you disagreed with public health officials, which is another way of saying health bureaucrats and politicians, how is that not just raw political censorship? I think that the media and YouTube and big tech companies lost a lot of public trust because of that censorship.
To your credit, you have a long history of fighting these rules.
I republished the Danish cartoons of Mohammed. This was almost 20 years ago. I published them because there was this big fuss around the world and they were banned everywhere. And I wanted the readers of my magazine...
Showing the cartoons, even in Canada, banned.
Yeah, and I didn't show them as an endorsement. I showed them as a prosecutor might put a piece of evidence to a jury. Here's what all the fuss is
Here's
about.
what's causing the riots.
And I was hauled before something called the Human Rights Commission and charged with promoting hatred or contempt against an identifiable group.
You did win.
Well, they dropped the case after 900 days. I was still saddled with my own costs. I mean,
$100,000.
Yeah, I mean, even in Canadian dollars, that's a lot of money. And again, that's a lesson to others. If Rebel News or Ezra Levant can be roughed up by us, if David Menzies will be beat up, you'd better mind your P's and Q's.
A lot of people believe America succeeded because of freedom of speech, because contrarian ideas could fight it out and the best one wins. And look at the prosperity in the West and the fall of the Soviet Union. But look at Singapore. Singapore's doing well, really well, and they don't have freedom of speech.
I'm not an expert in Singapore, but I know the stories of Turkey and Japan a little bit. Turkey banned the printing press. And I think it is one of the reasons why the Muslim world, which was actually for a while intellectually and scientifically on par with the West, fell behind. There was a concept of ijtihad. The gates are closed. We know the truth. Anything else is haram. And in Japan,
we know what needs to be known. Everything else is unnecessary.
And Japan had the same thing too. Japan closed itself off to outside ideas.
Hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. I think the finest defense of free speech ever written was, if I'm pronouncing it right, Areopagitica. And if you look at the arguments for free speech that were written hundreds of years ago, this is in the United Kingdom, and it's one of the reasons why not just America, but the West, I mean, the UK itself is actually the birthplace of our modern notions of free speech. And I think the Industrial Revolution and scientific evolution, scientific debate, and political progress. Think of every social battle to abolish slavery. There was slavery on every continent in the world. It was in the UK where it was debated and challenged in the spirit of free speech. The UK that had started to abolish slavery around the world. Think of equality for men and women, the suffragette movement. Think about the Black civil rights movement. Think about the gay rights movement. In each of those instances, the weaker party, the party demanding change, didn't have money or political power, but it had the power of an idea whose time had come. And had they been censored by the powers that be, had there been censorship laws in place for aggravating, annoying, upsetting, every one of those ideas I've just mentioned was aggravating, annoying, upsetting in its time. But freedom of speech was able to level the playing field. It's a tool for the underdog.
Let's look at a couple examples where free speech would have helped. China suffered the worst lockdowns, the biggest economic harm from them, because people weren't allowed to complain. Some did eventually anyway.
Absolutely. Let me give you another example, Chernobyl. In the early days and weeks, to save face, the Soviet regime didn't want to acknowledge what had happened. Cut off the phones around Chernobyl, lied to the West.
The accident is well under control.
When the people ask questions that are not in their own best interest, cut the phone lines, contain the spread of misinformation.
It was only when the West detected the radiation on their own, their motive was cover it up.
The leaders always want to cover it up.
They sure do. And in the Western system, the press is there to smoke things out, either formally through freedom of information requests or just the fear that politicians are going to be caught in a lie by the media. They don't have that fear in China or the former Soviet Union because the media were controlled. Justin Trudeau doesn't have a lot of fear of the media because he sort of controls the journalists. Total control in Iran, China, former Soviet Union. And that's why those countries went so wrong so far, because everyone was lying to the leader. No one wanted to tell the leader what was really going on. In a way, free speech helps the leader because he gets real information on how he's doing, how his policies are doing.
You'd have a hard time convincing them of that. You really want to let some free speech criticize you because he'll be better.
In the Canadian system, we take the biggest complainer in the country. We give him a fancy job title and a house to live in. We call him His Majesty's Loyal Opposition. Just stop and think about that for a second. Loyal opposition, loyal to the country, loyal to the king, but we pay him to oppose every day. The second most powerful person in Canada's politics, his job description is oppose, criticize.
Explain this. The opposition leader, who got the second most votes, is given a house?
Yeah, given a staff and a budget and a title, the leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And it's a tradition that goes back a long time.
Well, that sounds great, but if Canada has that, why is Canada so messed up?
Well, that's one of many checks and balances. And I think the strength of America, it has more checks and balances than perhaps any other system in the world. And Canada lacks a few of them.
And you in Canada, you envy Americans because we have the First Amendment?
Absolutely, especially the fact that I've chosen to be a contrarian journalist.
One of your employees even left
Yeah, I mean, that was because our crackdown during the pandemic was so harsh. He left the province that had the curfew.
He went to Florida and still works for you?
Yeah, a lot of Canadians hold America high as an example of freedom. And I think we would be better if we had that in our culture. But let me tell you the other point of view when I look at America. I would like Americans to study what's going on in Canada, because I think we're a dystopian time machine. If you look at what's happening in Canada today, I think it's a glimpse of America's future 5 or 10 years down the road if you continue down the path of authoritarianism. And so I know Americans don't pay a lot of attention to what happens in Canada.
Yeah.
It's a bland, vanilla, friendly place that nothing bad ever happens.
Just 40 million people.
I think that we're a laboratory of bad ideas.
All this stuff in Canada is bad, but we in America have the First Amendment, so we're not in danger.
Well, I think your president has talked about bringing in kinds of censorship, that digital safety commissioner. We see through litigation now that government agencies, the FBI, the CIA, were in constant direct contact with social media companies. I think that the United States has a special burden to defend freedom of speech, not just for yourself, but for all of us. I'm up in Canada using Twitter, an American company. People in Australia and Brazil are using Twitter. We depend on your First Amendment, even in our foreign countries.
As I said, I'm grateful to live in the U.S., where speech is relatively free. And here on Stossel TV, we use that freedom to report on government overreach. To get all our reports, please subscribe and hit the notification bell.